Hallo Leute, ich bin nicht Katja, ich bin Laura from Pennsylvania und ihr seht Deutsch für euch.
Hallo Leute! Guess what? We've reached episode 100. Whoa! Episode 100! And for that occasion, I wanted to do something special. Now, a few of you have asked me in the past to do something like the Draw My Life trend that's been a thing on YouTube for a few years. But you all know how I am about oversharing the details of my life, so that's not happening. Instead, I'm doing something much more closely related to this channel, and that's Draw My Life Language Edition. Before I get into it, this episode is sponsored by Lingoda. You can still get a discount on their classes using this code. Stay tuned until the end to learn more about them. And also, another little by the by, I invite anybody who's interested to pick up this modification of the meme and do their own version of it. So let's get started on the evolution of my language knowledge and once and for all answer the questions of why is your English so good and how many languages do you speak? So as most of you will know by now, I was born in Germany to German parents, which means that German was the language we spoke at home and that I was raised with. I was fairly interested in speaking well pretty early on too, and even then seemed to have a knack for grammar, as my mom distinctly remembers me correcting my own sentence errors at early kindergarten age. So, this channel was meant to happen even back then. I remember my parents doing a lot of reading, singing, talking, playing, and rhyming with us, so a lot of language-involved activities, which definitely played a big role in making me conscious of my speech. Now, like I said, this all happened in German. My parents both speak other languages, but never decided to integrate them into our early education. Elementary schools also were not usually offering English at the time I was at the right age for them, so English classes for grade schoolers were already a thing, but they were being offered by university students or native speakers, but they were never mandatory. However, my earliest contact with the English language actually came not through school, but through my best friend, as one of her parents is American. So whenever I would go over to their house, I would hear bits and pieces of English, none of which I'd understand, of course, but I do think it played a role in schooling my ear and reception for English, or even foreign language in general. Her parent also ended up offering one of those voluntary English courses I mentioned at my elementary school when we were in 3rd grade, which is how I got a very basic and very fun jump start before finally starting mandatory English classes when I entered gymnasium, so starting with 5th grade. That was the deal for the next 2 years, which means that English was the only foreign language I knew and was really even interested in, and I did fairly well from the beginning. I'd already decided languages were my thing by then. Also, my German teacher in 6th grade did a pretty good grammar unit with us, which, as far as I know, was mandatory for everybody, but it was taught at different degrees of quality depending on the teacher, so I guess I got lucky. Anyway, I loved that unit, and I found it came to me very easily. Now, this is where things start to get a bit confusing because we have a lot of input over the next few years, so try to keep up. First off, in 7th grade, I picked up Latin as my second foreign language. Of course, I never learned to speak it or even write creatively because why would you? Since classes were focused on enabling us to translate, but it later turned out to be a fantastic tool for other languages and for a general understanding of grammar. But, before I get to that, getting ahead of myself here. On the English front, at the end of the 6th or maybe even beginning of the 7th grade, that was when I started getting into the internet, which, except for a comparatively limited space back then, was in English, not in German. So of course I knew websites in German, but if you wanted to explore a bit, you would end up with English very fast. I also started to get into anime. Now, this being quite a few years ago now, German voiceover wasn't readily available for anything but very popular titles, such as Dragon Ball Z or One Piece or Pokemon, and German fan subbing groups were still starting out. And, I was not that internet savvy yet. I knew my way around, but still accumulating a library. So during the first few years, I had to make do with English subtitles, which helped with learning vocabulary, since I wanted to know what was going on, obviously, as well as with, believe it or not, reflecting on what was correct or not, just thinking about the language a bit, since English anime subs famously contain some very funny errors sometimes. Additionally, this was when YouTube started out, so I started watching early vloggers, which again, were pretty much all in English. I remember creating my first YouTube account specifically to subscribe to the Winecone, who some of you might still remember. He's actually still on here, although not as active as he used to be. Anyway, that plus discovering the world of stand-up comedy through anime parodies mostly helped so much with learning colloquial, fast-spoken, or, just natively spoken English outside of English textbooks. That's also when I started speaking to my appliances, my cat, and my mirror in English. And that's pretty much where I've been going from ever since. Maybe kind of interesting for you and maybe also a little encouraging. This is a clip I found from the summer after 7th grade, I think, with a great example of my early English fluency.
Hey everyone! So this is me recording a first video with sound. And now guess why that is? I have a new camera! Yes! So first of all, I'd like to say I apologize if you have a problem with these short cuts. But I have to do those because if the videos are too long, I can't import to my computer, and that will be pretty annoying, wouldn't it?
Anyway, around this time was also when I dabbled in Italian for a bit, but I forgot pretty much all of it over the course of the next few years. That's sad, but, what you gonna do? Latin was still going on when I entered 9th grade, which is when I started with French. Unfortunately, French never became my best friend. I was interested in it simply for the sake of learning a new language, but we never really warmed up to each other. I always would have preferred Spanish had they offered it at the time, but French was really my only option aside from going into the science route, which I didn't want to do. So, French it is. But I do think that a lot of my disliking of the language, as so often, was probably sadly owed to my teacher, who was highly competent as a French speaker, but way too authoritative and discouraging as a high school language teacher. And while I personally was never affected by this, he could be pretty mean and kind of a bully to students he didn't like, so that also really made me unfairly, but it made me dislike French. He then was followed up by a teacher who was neither especially competent in the language nor in teaching. On the upside, though, I still ended up sticking with it because I wanted to get as much out of my French education as possible until the end of school, even though I could have dropped it, and I had a strict but awesome teacher for the last 2 years. I have, however, since forgotten about 60% of what I once knew about French. Sad story. Now, rewinding a bit from my Abitur, 9th grade was also when I started to teach myself Japanese more seriously outside of anime, which was, of course, the original starting point. I never went to any classes until a few years later, and I progressed fairly well, but with Japanese also, I forgot a lot due to lack of usage. That quickly goes away if you don't hone it. However, even though my active vocabulary is too sparse and way too slow, even though that's gone down, I do fairly well with understanding it, and I can usually follow everyday conversations, so there's that. Plus, that best friend I was talking about earlier is now a pro-Japanese speaker, so seiko ni omedetou! So cut to quite a few years later. I had not really learned any new language outside of learning a few phrases of Spanish and Wolof, which is a language from West Africa, mainly spoken in Senegal and Gambia, for those of you who don't know, Dutch and Danish, none of which I speak, by the way, so it was a bit time for me to get into something more serious again. Unknown to most of you, I didn't start out at uni studying to be a teacher immediately. I originally enrolled for law, but I didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I'd hoped. And then with DFE in the mix, I found that I was sitting in lectures with my brain just moaning at me, "You should have gone for a teaching degree after all." And I figured, why not? So I started with English and philosophy, but soon after made the spontaneous decision to start studying Russian because, well, not only because, but mostly because I had promised myself at some point during elementary school that I would learn at least one new language while in university. So I figured it was time to make good on that. That was in early 2014. А сейчас уже нормально говорю по-русски. So to sum up, so far I'm fluent in English and German. I speak Russian and French. I understand and write Japanese, can translate and passively draw from Latin, especially the latter. The translation is probably very rusty by now. I can get the gist of Dutch, just because the two languages are related, and I know bits and pieces of several other languages. And I sure hope that list will keep on growing as I keep on growing as a person. And that wraps up my language history thus far. Let me know whether you'd be interested in hearing me speak any of these or other languages, or even if you want to submit a few phrases in a language that you'd like to hear me say, and I'll do my best. However, before I go, once again, I want to say a quick word about Lingoda, my sponsor for this episode, which, by the way, thank you, Lingoda. Thank you very much. They are an online language service that offers face-to-face classes, so kind of like, Skype sessions, basically, both in private and group settings that pick you up where you are at, whether you are stuck or you're just trying to speed up the process or you're just starting out. And they also are a rare source, online source for the CEFR certificate, so the A1, B1, etc. levels after 90% course completion with them. So, if you are tired of doing everything by yourself and feel like a private tutor would benefit you, just click the link in the description and enter this code on the screen, DFE2, DFE2, to get a 15% discount of your classes for however long you decide to sign up with them. And that's it for me for today. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you for a regular class next time. Tschüss!